It started with silence. Not the silence of a calm night or a peaceful forest, but an unnatural, suffocating stillness that fell over the world in an instant. One moment, the hum of engines, the chatter of voices, and the buzz of electricity surrounded us. The next, it was all gone. Planes fell from the sky like wounded birds, their engines choking mid-flight. Cities flickered and went dark. Radios emitted only static. It wasn't war. It wasn't famine. It wasn't a virus. It was something we didn't understand, and it had come without warning. The world stopped communicating. Phones wouldn't ring, screens wouldn't light, and every digital trace of our interconnected lives vanished. Panic spread like wildfire. Without orders, without guidance, the systems we depended on collapsed. Emergency responders stood helpless, their radios dead. Parents screamed for their children in the chaos. People flooded the streets, searching for answers, but there was no one to provide them. I was there when it happened. Sitting in my garage, tinkering with a stubborn generator, I thought at first it was just another power outage. But when I went outside, the sight of my neighbors standing in the street, their faces painted with fear, told me otherwise. The silence wasn't just here. It was everywhere. No cars, no sirens, no voices on the wind, only the quiet. Then the sky changed. It wasn't immediate, but those who looked up saw it first, faint ripples, like oil spreading across the clouds. Lights danced in patterns that didn't belong to any weather phenomenon. We watched, too stunned to run. And then they came. The ships were massive, their black silhouettes blocking out the moon. They moved without a sound, defying every law of physics we thought we understood. Some tried to explain it: aliens, experimental tech, the wrath of God, but no one had answers. All we knew was that they were here, and the silence was their doing. The hunters appeared soon after. They weren't like the ships. These were predators, their sleek forms gliding through the ruins of our cities, seeking movement, sound, or anything alive. We called them hunters because that's what they were, creatures designed to track and kill. They didn't hesitate, didn't negotiate. Anyone caught in their path was eliminated without mercy. I remember the first time I saw one. Its metallic limbs moved with eerie precision, its head swiveling unnaturally as it scanned its surroundings. I held my breath, crouched in the shadows of my garage, watching it pass by. It didn't notice me. I was lucky. Others weren't. As days turned into weeks, the world grew quieter. Survivors learned to move in silence, to breathe lightly, to exist without drawing attention. Whispers became forbidden. Footsteps were measured. Every sound was a risk. But even in the quiet, we refused to give up. We didn't know why they came. We didn't know what they wanted. But we knew one thing: they weren't here to coexist. Earth had been silenced, but humanity, we weren't done fighting. Survival wasn't about bravery or strength, it was about adaptation. When the silence came, humanity's greatest weapon wasn't our technology or armies. It was our ability to endure. At first, it was chaos. People screamed, ran, and fought. Those who clung to old habits didn't last long. The hunters found them, drawn to the noise like moths to a flame. But those of us who learned to move quietly, to think differently, we survived. We scavenged what we could. Cities were graveyards now, but they were full of tools. Old radios, wind-up generators, bicycles, anything that didn't rely on the power grids that had failed us. We taught ourselves skills our ancestors once knew. Fire without matches. Shelter without machines. Communication without words. The silence wasn't just our enemy, it became our way of life. The hunters were relentless. They swept through the ruins, their sleek forms scanning for any sign of resistance. They didn't understand us, not really. They thought breaking our technology would break us. They didn't account for our stubbornness. We didn't need gadgets to fight. We had instinct, ingenuity, and each other. In the early days, I found a group of survivors. Strangers, at first. A teacher, a nurse, a farmer, a kid who couldn't have been more than 10. We were from different worlds, but none of that mattered anymore. We became a team, a family. We watched each other's backs, shared what little food we found, and worked together to stay one step ahead of the hunters. Communication was the hardest part. Words were dangerous, so we invented a system of gestures and signals. A raised hand meant stop. A tap on the shoulder meant move. It was crude but effective. Over time, we got better. A mechanic in the group rigged an old shortwave radio. It couldn't transmit, but it could receive. One night, through the static, we heard something, a faint voice, distorted but unmistakably human. We weren't alone. That moment changed everything. Until then, survival had been about the day-to-day. But hearing that voice gave us a goal. If there were others out there, it meant there was hope. We started mapping our surroundings, using what little we had to try and connect with anyone else who might still be alive. The hunters weren't perfect. We noticed patterns. They moved in predictable sweeps, their sensors scanning for sound and heat. They didn't seem to understand improvisation. One night, when they cornered us in an old warehouse, we used broken mirrors and old pipes to create false signals. They chased shadows while we slipped away. It wasn't much, but it was proof. They could be fooled. The silence didn't break us. It forced us to adapt. Every day we stayed alive was a small victory, a reminder that humanity's strength wasn't in its machines but in its will to endure. We were scattered, outmatched, and hunted. But we weren't defeated. Not yet. Hope came in fragments, in moments that reminded us we weren't just running, we were learning. The hunters may have silenced our technology, but they didn't silence our minds. Every encounter, every narrow escape, taught us more about how they operated. They relied on precision, on patterns. They expected fear to make us predictable. What they didn't anticipate was our ability to think differently, to adapt faster than they could react. It started with a discovery. While scavenging through an abandoned factory, we found something buried beneath layers of dust, an old, rusted signal jammer. It was primitive by their standards, something used decades ago during protests or riots, but it sparked an idea. The hunters relied on their advanced sensors to track us, and if we could disrupt those, even briefly, it could give us an edge. The first test was simple. We rigged the jammer to a car battery and placed it near an old highway. When the hunters approached, their sleek forms faltered. Their movements slowed, erratic, as if they were struggling to process their surroundings. It didn't last long, seconds at most, but it was enough to confirm what we needed. They weren't invincible. From there, the plan grew. We started looking for anything that could interfere with their systems, electromagnetic pulses, reflective surfaces, even sound waves pitched just right. We didn't have the resources for a full-scale attack, but we could strike back in small ways. Ambushes, diversions, traps. For the first time, it felt like we were doing more than just surviving. One of our biggest victories came almost by accident. A group of us was pinned down in an abandoned subway station. The hunters were closing in, their scanners lighting up the walls around us. We had nowhere to go, but we had a cache of old fireworks scavenged days earlier. In a desperate move, we set them off, flooding the tunnels with light and noise. The hunters recoiled, their systems overwhelmed by the chaos. They retreated, giving us enough time to escape. That moment stayed with us. It wasn't just about fighting smarter. It was about using everything we had, no matter how unconventional. Word of our successes began to spread. Through whispers, signals, and the faint crackle of shortwave radios, other survivor groups started reaching out. They shared what they'd learned, how to mask heat signatures with blankets, how to rig abandoned vehicles as distractions. We weren't alone anymore. But the most important discovery came from an unlikely source, a scavenged alien drone, damaged but intact. We spent days examining it, piecing together fragments of their technology. What we found was a weakness they hadn't hidden well. The hunters were networked, their systems synchronized through a central hub. If we could disrupt that hub, we could disrupt all of them. It was a long shot, but it was the first real strategy we had. The balance of power had shifted. They came to silence us, to break us, but all they'd done was teach us how to fight back. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was resistance. This was it. Everything we had learned, everything we had endured, came down to one last chance. The hunters were relentless, but their network made them vulnerable. If we could take out their central hub, the massive mothership hovering above the ruins of what used to be a city, we could sever their control and turn the tide. The plan was dangerous, almost suicidal, but there was no alternative. If we failed, humanity's last spark would be snuffed out for good. The survivors gathered what little we had. Old radios, salvaged explosives, and weapons built from scraps of metal and broken machinery. It wasn't much, but it didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to work. Using the drone we had captured, we identified a weak point in the mothership's defenses, a vent near its underside, shielded but accessible if we could get close enough. The problem was the fleet of hunters guarding it. We moved at night, silent and methodical, spreading out to confuse their patrols. Decoys were set, rigged cars and speakers that emitted bursts of sound to lure the hunters away from our path. Every step was calculated. We couldn't afford mistakes. As we approached the mothership, the scale of it was staggering. It loomed like a black monolith, pulsing with alien energy. The ground trembled beneath it, and the air felt heavy, charged with static. The hunters patrolled the area in perfect synchronization, their movements precise, mechanical. But we had learned how to disrupt that order. Our team split into two groups. One would create a massive diversion, drawing the hunters away, while the other would make the approach. I was in the second group, carrying the makeshift explosives we had rigged to a timer. It wasn't advanced technology, but it didn't need to be. Humanity's strength was never in its tools, it was in its ability to improvise. The diversion worked. Fireworks, mirrors, and sound waves sent the hunters scattering, their coordination breaking down just long enough for us to reach the vent. The seconds stretched into eternity as we planted the charges, every movement careful, every sound muffled. We knew the hunters would adapt quickly, and we had no room for error. As we set the final charge, they found us. The hunters swarmed, their metallic forms descending like a wave. But we were ready. The distraction team, still nearby, unleashed their final trap, a massive EMP pulse cobbled together from old batteries and wiring. It wasn't enough to destroy them, but it caused chaos in their ranks, giving us the window we needed to retreat. We barely made it out before the charges detonated. The explosion lit up the sky, a blinding burst that tore through the mothership's vent. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ship began to falter, its lights flickering, its hull groaning under the strain. The hunters froze mid-motion, their network severed. One by one, they collapsed, lifeless and inert. We had done it. Against all odds, we had struck a blow they never expected. The silence began to lift. And as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, we knew this wasn't just survival anymore. This was humanity's victory.